Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on best practice in data fabric design in Appian. So my name is Michael Cherlin. I work in customer success. I'm a senior Appian architect. Here with me is Joe Torres from Axiom. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hey there, I'm Joe Torres, and I work in our EVA operations office. I'm also a certified spacesuit engineer and technician.
Yeah, you got to be a little bit louder, they said.
A little louder? All right, let's move it up.
Move it up a notch.
How's that? Much better?
Can you guys hear him?
No?
You got to project.
How about now?
Is your mic on?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on.
Any better?
Just yell to. Yeah, I guess you
Just
gotta
talk louder?
Talk louder.
Okay. I'll talk down. How about that? Yeah, so my name is Joe Torres, and I work in our EVA business operations office, and I'm also a certified spacesuit engineer and technician.
All right, so, okay, there we go. So best practice. Best practice is it's a loaded word, I would say. It kind of indicates there's a lot of things you shouldn't be doing. They're bad practices. Well, I would argue that best practices don't have to be complicated. Some of the best practices they're actually quite simple. So let me take a step back. When I was asked to give this presentation, I was a little bit stymied. To explain why, let me tell you a little bit about my history at Appian. So I've worked for Appian for about 12 years. Used to be in the professional services, now it's called the customer success department. And from day one, I've been tasked with helping customers with their most complicated problems. They're giving them technical solutions for things that Appian didn't quite handle right out of the box. You know, it started back in 2012, it was the static form designer, and people wanted dynamic forms, so we had to give them JavaScript to help them achieve dynamic forms. And it continued with custom Java development, building plugins and expressions. I'm sure you've seen my name on the app market. And then it really ramped up when Appian started adopting databases, relational databases to store our data. It used to be in process, it was moved to relational databases, and with that move, you brought a new requirement to the Appian developer. You needed to be a little bit of a DBA. You needed to know how to build in SQL. You needed to understand indices. You needed to be able to build views and stored procedures. You needed to be able to use explain plans to understand why your interfaces were performing the way they were. Now, Appian has slowly removed those requirements. You know, I no longer have to write JavaScript. We've got Sail. I no longer need to write plugins because a lot of it's been moved into the product. Big example of that would be the integration designer. You used to have to write plugins for every single integration. And up to a couple years ago, we still needed those SQL skills in order to really build the most performant and scalable applications in Appian. However, nowadays, when somebody asks, well, what's your advice for using the data fabric? Well, that brings us back to this presentation and why it stymied me so much. Because my advice is actually incredibly simple. It's almost embarrassingly simple. So I mean, how do you give a presentation when the advice is as Nike says, just do it? So that brings us to our agenda today. I'm going to take you through our best practices around the data fabric, and then I'm going to hand it over to Joe, and he's going to take us through the Axiom use case. We'll talk a little bit about how some of those issues and the best practices we talk about for the data fabric apply to their application development at Axiom. And I think we'll probably have some time for questions and answers. All right, so what is the data fabric? I am sure you've heard about the data fabric if you've been at Appian World before, or even if you've spent a couple hours or done a couple sessions today. But I'll go over it just in case. So the data fabric is almost always, at least when we define it, defined in contrast to the more traditional data lake or data warehouse, where your system is asked to collect data from its disparate systems, bring it all into one place, and it's typically only used for analytics purposes, for writing reports. Well, for Appian, that's not sufficient. We're writing applications, we're running transactional processes through our applications. We can't be expected to pull data into our system, usually on a scheduled basis where it's a little bit stale. You're not necessarily writing it back to that system. We want to leave the data in its source of truth, but we want to still be able to use it for analytics purpose and for reporting purposes, for filtering, sorting, aggregating. But we also want to be able to write back to it. So that's where the data fabric comes in. At the core of it, the data fabric is really, it's a cache that we have internally within Appian that we use for most of our analytical purposes. And then it also works with some integrations in order for us to push the data back out to whatever the source system is. So now that you understand a little bit about what the data fabric, what is my first best practice? Well, I talked about it before. You just do it. You sync everything. Sync as much as you can into the data fabric. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious here to make a point, but what do I mean by sync everything? Well, I mean all of the data that's going to be shown in your grids, your reports, data you want to filter, sort, aggregate. It's best if it belongs in that data fabric. Why do we want the data in the data fabric? Well, there's a few reasons. The number one for me and the teams I work with is that it really accelerates your development. I don't have any numbers around this, but I would say from my anecdotal experience, having built a lot of applications over the last few years, I would say it's about 2 to 3 times faster working with the data fabric as opposed to a traditional CDT and data store approach. You don't need to worry about views. You don't need to worry about optimizing your views or explain plans. And that touches on my second topic here, which is optimization. As I mentioned at the beginning, we used to have this requirement to work with Appian that you were a little bit of a DBA, or at least you had a DBA somewhere on your team that was handling the performance issues that may be caused by the way that you build your application. Well, it's not really necessary anymore. No longer do you need to go into the database and run an explain plan and look at the view and make sure that I'm joining correctly, make sure that I create indices on all the right columns so that the queries that are made in my production system have been optimized for the database that I'm using. Right now, all of that's handled by the data fabric's back end. You just don't really need to worry about it anymore. I mean, I can't remember the last time I had to run an explain plan for one of my teams and help them fix their database. The other thing that comes from creating your synced records is free power. A lot of the features that Appian is developing these days, they're dependent on your records being synced, right? So a few examples I have here, records chat, the process HQ, I'm sure you've heard about these in some other sessions. But there's some other development-centric features which really drive to that acceleration. Things like records-powered charts, records-powered grids, records-powered pickers. A lot of those features are dependent on you using the data fabric and syncing those records. Now, first, I really want you to understand that synced records in the data fabric aren't really it doesn't take a lot of time to develop using those. It's not adding a lot of extra toil on your developers. It's something that the platform really almost forces you to do. So when you go to create a new record type, there's going to be a really big box saying sync your record, and a tiny itty little bit of box that says, do you want to use data stores? You're encouraged at every step of the way, every step during design, to use the best practice in Appian, to use those synced records. The last thing I want to touch on here for synced records is future-proofing those applications. As I mentioned before, some of the features that are coming out these days, like Process HQ, the data catalog, the ability to create end-user reports directly in the front end. Along with those, I imagine, and I've seen over the years, there's going to be more features that come out, especially features around AI, that are going to be dependent on that data living in the data fabric. So you want to include as much in there so that you can take advantage of those features when they come out without having to do additional development. They'll just suddenly be available to you. So to ensure you get that extra functionality, you want to ensure that you sync your records. Now, you might say, that sounds like a lot of work. You're asking me to sync all these records in Appian. Well, it's really not. Creating a sync record is incredibly easy. You can create a sync record on top of an existing data type in CDT and data store. And in fact, I think there's a presentation on that later today. It takes 20 clicks. You choose the table, you choose which fields you want to include in your sync, and you're off to the races. Creating a new synced record is even easier. You don't even have to touch the database anymore to create that. So creating synced records, pretty easy. But you might say, well, what if I can't sync my record, right? What if I have too many rows? What if I don't own the data? What if I need a more frequent refresh than that daily refresh we give you right now? Well, you probably can sync your record, and I would argue that you probably should sync your record. Say you have more than 4 million rows. Well, sync the last 4 million rows. So use the keep data available at high volumes feature to say, well, I want to keep the last 4 million rows using this column as my last updated, and I want to keep the last 4 million updated rows. And the rest of the data is still in the database. You can still access it through your old approach using query entity. But now you get all those sync record features on the last 4 million rows, which probably gives a lot of value to your business users. And by doing it this way, when we increase the sync limit beyond 4 million to whatever the next number is, you're going to now have 10 million rows, and maybe that is all you needed. Maybe you don't own the data. Well, we have options available. You can set up a scheduled sync, pull that data over a web service every day. You can create through a single click a webhook, or they call it generated web API. But essentially, that's a webhook for an external system to call Appian. With a single click, we've created it. And you can call Appian, and Appian will be alerted that a particular row is updated, and then you can update your sync associated with it. Maybe you need a more frequent refresh. We had this issue actually at Axiom, where they had data in an external system. It was only available over web API, but they wanted it to be refreshed every 4 hours. Well, you still have the entire Appian platform available to you. You can create a process that syncs more frequently. So we had a process that synced, I think it was every 4 hours.
That's correct.
Yeah. So, sync everything. Everyone get that one? Yeah? Yeah? All right, next best practice. Relate everything, yes. All right, so what is the data fabric without relationships, right? Having a single sync record, there's not a lot of value in that. The value really comes from when you relate disparate records and even different data sources together. So let's take this data model, for example. We've got Salesforce has some of our customer and opportunity data. We've got Appian with our order data. Additional order data is over in SAP. We've got some product information in Oracle. Maybe some documentation is in SharePoint. Well, with the data fabric, once you connect up and create these relationships, a user from the front end using the data catalog could write a report saying, okay, I want to group my customers by product category and the total value of all the opportunities that have open orders, right? Something pretty complicated. And you'd see that's crossing 4 different data sources. Some of your data is in Salesforce, some of your data is in Appian, some of your data is in SAP, some is in Oracle. But the users don't need to have access to all these 4 systems. You don't need to set up accounts. You don't need to pay for accounts, right? You pull that data into one place. The user learns one UI. They learn how to use Appian, and they can make reports across all that data and take action against that data. So what else do you get with relationships? Well, a lot of the features that are tied to record types are really, they get the most value when you start adding relationships between your record types. So a big example would be row-level security. So row-level security is for a single record type. So say we have cases, a row-level security would be, well, I can see this case, but I can't see this case. A lot of times when you're setting up that security, a lot of the record types, you shouldn't have to set up security for every individual record type. If I see a case, I just want to be able to see that case's comments. Or maybe if I could see a customer, I want to see all that customer's cases, right? So with relationships, you can set up that record row-level security by just inheriting the security from another record type. So if I can see that customer, when I go to set up security on my case, I can see the case if I can see the customer, and I can see the note if I can see the case, if I can see the customer. So that feature becomes vastly more valuable when you start relating more records together. Another one is custom fields. So I would argue the most valuable custom fields are ones that aggregate data across your relationships, right? So say I had an order and I wanted to see the total of that order. Well, I could calculate it in process, and every time I change an order line item, I need to go recalculate it and save it against the database. Or I could just set up a simple custom field that just says, take the order line item, take its inventory, multiply by its price. Maybe the price is in a completely different system. Aggregate that together, sum all the prices, maybe add on a little bit of tax. Maybe the tax is stored in a different system because it's dependent on state. And then I have a sum that's my total for that order, but I don't need to calculate it in process. And now, because it's a custom field, I can use it not just for displaying on a UI, but I can filter and I can sort just as it was a normal field, right? So now business users don't need to know how to calculate the cost. They can use in a report just by using that custom field that you've built for them. Another one is a new feature that we've released recently, which is record events. It's not so much you need relationships for record events, it's more that record events are by nature related data. So one of the things you can do now with Appian is whenever you save a record, you can automatically create an event against it. So for example, I created an order, I've got a created order event. I updated the order, I've got an updated order event. And the reason these are really important is that the new feature that they're announcing throughout this Appian world is Process HQ and Process Insights. And in order to really get insights out of your process, you need to capture milestones of that process so you can see where you're getting waylaid during it. So definitely set up those record events for all of your records. I threw it under relationships because they are underlying related data. And the last one is business user. I already touched on this. The relationships are really what makes that data catalog and that end user reporting so valuable. You know, if you have just a single table, you're not going to get a lot of insights. The insights come when you get data from systems that you don't normally have access to. And we'll talk about that a little bit later with Axiom. That was one of their main issues. They needed data from a system that they didn't have a user account for. All right, just like creating record types, relationships are fast and easy, very simple to create. Couple clicks on the record type designer, select a field that joins the two tables together, select a relationship type, you got a relationship. And setting up the inverse, so from order to order line item, you can set up the order line item back to the order. Setting up that inverse relationship is just a single click. And I would argue you should always set it up both ways just to help your people report on them later, help your business users. All right, so sync everything, relate everything. What's the third one? Secure everything. All right, so now that Appian, I've been playing Spider-Man on PS5 recently, so that's really what made me think of this. Now that Appian is releasing some of these end user reporting features, it's more critical than ever that we ensure that everything is secured properly. Now, you might say, oh, well, you're making us do more work. If we use our data fabric, now we need to worry about security. Well, that's not true. You've always needed to worry about security, but previously your security was in your interfaces, in your sites, in your expression rules, in your data store, on the database, right? You had this security that was spread amongst 5, 10 different kinds of design objects, but which might be hundreds of objects, right? Now all of your security can take place in one object type. Still multiple objects, but one object type, and you're dealing with your record type. So, that's also pretty easy. This used to be very difficult. In fact, when someone would come to me 5 years ago and say, I want to set up row-level security on my record types, I would try my best to not let them do it. I would say, you're gonna have scalability issues, you're gonna have optimization issues, you're gonna have lots of performance. We shouldn't do it. Let's put our interface filters directly in the interface, just not worry about it at the back end. And you know, it might have been the right answer back then, but it is not the right answer these days. In the last couple years, we've released a complete low-code design experience for setting up our row-level security. So now, getting a secured record type is just 3 steps. Record type security, which is the same security that you're dealing with every Appian object. So you've got this group can see this thing. That's simple. The second is a newer feature. So this is what workspace is your record type available in. Previously, your record type would be available in Tempo and maybe on a site. But now there's that front-end interface that users can use to build their own reports. And not all record types belong in that front end. Maybe it's a transactional ETL process and you don't want your record type up there. Or maybe it's something that's really private and you don't want anyone reporting on it. Well, you can click on and off whether that record, I think by default it's off, but you can toggle any record type to be available through that front-end data catalog. So that's the second thing you need to do. And the third thing you need to do is set up row-level security. I would argue row-level security should probably be set up on every single record type. If you haven't set it up, you don't know if you've asked the right questions. Set it up simply if you need to, but at least know that you've addressed that this record type has been secured to the right users. And a lot of the times, that security rule, as I mentioned before, is going to be incredibly simple. I can see this record if I can see the related record. So, just to summarize, we've got 3 best practices. You want to sync everything, you want to relate everything, and you want to secure everything. And this takes us right back to what I talked about at the beginning. It's really difficult these days to not follow those best practices. So I've included on the left side of the screen the record type design tabs that you'll see when you create a record type. So this is all in a single object within Appian. You've got your data model that touches on the fields, the table, the relationships. You've got your events, which touches on that record events relationship I talked about earlier, where you're capturing events as you are making changes to your record. You've got your sync options. That touches on the features where you can keep the last 4 million rows, whether you want to schedule your sync, whether you want to set up a web API to receive information about whether your record has changed externally. You've got your workspaces, which is where you can toggle whether that record type is available in the front end. And you've got your security last, which is kind of broken into two parts, that row level security, or record level security it's called here, and then that view and action security, which is also important and I think is critical that we set up correctly for future features that may come out with Appian. So I'm going to hand it over to Joe now to talk a little bit about the Axiom story. Oh, he lost his mic.
A little too loose there. See if I can get it fixed. All right. Sound better? All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with Appian. And going through the digital thread, we had a couple applications that we threw around conceptually of how we wanted to capture data and improve processes for our kind of order to delivery of our flight hardware and non-class goods. Design, obviously, through engineering of these parts that are going through the system. Testing of those parts, whether they go through NASA-based training or, where we have a picture of a spacesuit here at our Pogo facility at JSC. The eventual manufacturing of flight-based hardware that's going to go up on orbit, the operational use case, the day in and out of usage and planning for maintenance activities to eventual retirement or mark obsolete. And so this kind of transcends the different departments, if you will, of the kind of organizations that it moves across. And this is kind of a graphic of all of our systems that we integrate with. Appian is our prime integrator. So we have document management through Box that is backed by records. Java is our requirements database. All of our specs that NASA adheres us to, requirements are listed in there. Jira is obviously our kind of an agile solution for tracking work, like sprint activity, impediments, things of that nature. PDM is our engineering product file, where all of our parts are listed in model-based design, which we capture by card displays. And Confluence is kind of like our knowledge base, where we capture all of our documentation and know-how. And on the right side of that paradigm, you see our business systems like LIST, which is an Oracle-based system that captures our limited life inventory management data. And CostPoint is our ERP, so you find your parts, but also procurement, purchase order information. And then on the bottom, we have some services like Epsilon 3 that captures digital procedures management, with Appian kind of providing that single pane view, right, into all these different services. So our first pass at creating an application to capture these requests for parts, you can see that Appian has a form on the left side there where an engineer would request something, whether it be a part, a service. Then once he submits it, a material planner would then take this order and review it, all the details associated with what they're trying to request, and hand enter this information into two different systems. One of them being lists and the other one being CostPoint. And then they would create a purchase requisition, go through its purchase order life cycle, and eventually mark it as goods received in our ERP. As you can see, there's not as many blue boxes because this was our first pass at just creating a work queue for our material planners to kind of process the requests that were coming through the business. Our second cut is more exposed in Appian. So we partnered with Appian Customer Success to enhance this process. pushing if the part doesn't exist, for example, we would create them in both systems, list and cost point, with one click. So it would push to these both systems. And giving the engineer insight into the procurement aspect of the status of that procurement purchase requisition approval, as well as when the PO actually gets cut. And then when it finally receives on dock, one of our shipping and receiving leads would mark it as received, and it does show and sync based on a record into Appian. So these different stages, you'll see them sync on a timely basis, and as Michael was alluding to, we had to schedule these processes to sync every 4 hours because we needed that refresh to happen more often throughout the day. And this is kind of our record summary view of like, here's the request and where it is in process, currently being reviewed, and ability to take related actions on these records if you were in the appropriate group. Obviously, like an engineer can upload documents. They can't approve the request. A material planner has to review it before it actually gets moved through the next stage. And that's kind of where we're at, with it. Yeah, it's been interesting work with records-based centric design. I really like how it's easy to set up a lot of these actionable views, as well as nominate security based on who can take these actions or just view it. Before, alternatively, to what Micah was saying, the flip side of that was having to create a CDT and then use a data store entity and create all these different associations just to kind of maintain the data. It's a lot easier as well to create records-based charts too. Just recently created visualizations for NASA to capture insights into where the request is through drillable filters, if you will. So like pie charts and bar charts where you can click on a slice and it literally actively just paints the right side of the screen with record-based grids, as well as visualizations of those statuses, like show me all my requests that are in progress, or how many are new, right? So it's really easy to design those through records-based design.
Yeah, so I have a couple examples of some of those best practices. So we talked about sync everything. This is the chart for their record relationships for the application we were just talking about. So we've got lists, Appian, and cost point. A lot of them are little A's for Appian. That's because a lot of the cost point information was brought over through a process back sync, which means it ends up synced into the Appian database. But you can see very quickly how much data is accessible through that record relationship, and that's what allows us to build these features for Axiom so quickly and build out charts. It's because the data is already accessible, it's already secured, it's already related, so that when you get a new feature saying, oh, our material planners, they want to be notified when the purchase order is received, so that they don't need to go actively check. Well, say you got that requirement in and you hadn't synced any of that data, well, now you'd have to be going back to the web service development team and saying, okay, can you build this new web service so that I can get the data that I need to give to my users? Right? So a lot of Appian development and a lot of the features that we build, they're most beneficial because Appian developers are the fastest. They don't want to waste time waiting for other people to do work. They just want to get in there and they want to build your feature as quickly as possible. And when you have the data already available that you're required for those features to be built, then you don't need to go to those external systems. You don't need to worry about somebody building out a new web API. You just deal with the data as you have it, and you build out your little process saying, okay, I just synced it this 4 hours. Let's go look at all the new orders that just came in. Let's send out an email to everybody with a nice little format. Right? You can build that feature incredibly quickly, and that's because of the power of having all that data in the sync already. Right? All right, we talked about this already. Example number 2, unsyncable. What do you do if you have an unsyncable record, right? So, the web service that we were using for cost point, it didn't quite conform to what we needed to use an expression back synced record, right? And that you're going to run into that scenario, but that doesn't mean you can't sync that record. It just means that you might have a process that looks like this. I mean, look at how easy this process is. And this literally pulled from Axiom. I mean, I removed the exception handling because that looks complicated, but this is the process from Axiom.
It's clean.
The web service calls their cost point integration. It says, give me all the rows that updated since the last time I ran the sync, so since 4 hours ago. Give me all the rows that updated. And it returns it back in a JSON format with both so this is for PRs and POs, for both the PR purchase requisition and its line item. So it's a single big JSON structure. And we can take that, run it through a simple expression rule, and spit out a nested record that you can just write in a single node, right? So because you can write records and they're related records in a single node, this is what you run into. Query the data, write it. And now it's the synced record that you can use through your relationships. You can use to build a bunch of other features on top of, right? So example number 2. Example number 3. Now this one's really simple. I'm going to caveat that right away. But because we have this feature in Appian, it was so quick to develop. So the requirement here was when I create a new material request, so I'm a material planner, meaning I need to make sure that we have the right things to build stuff, right? So I'm making a material request. I need new parts from McMaster, right? Well, as I'm working on that and I'm gathering up my parts that I need, my request is in draft mode. I don't want anybody creating any PRs based on it. I'm still working on it, but I want to be able to save it so I can come back to it later, right? Well, that's a really common requirement. I want a draft version of my record, and I don't want anyone to see it until I'm done, right? Well, what's a really easy way to build that? Row-level security. I can see things that are draft if I made them. No one else can see it unless they're an admin. So you can see there's 3 rules here. I can see it if I made it and it's a draft. I can see it if it's not a draft, or I can see everything if I'm an admin, right? And once I build these rules, I can put people's names in, and I can test out with that record type, what records can this person see? And it's very easy to quickly set up record row-level rules like that. And this is a very simple one. I did caveat that before. But you can imagine much more complicated record row-level security, right? And I can give other examples if you want to ask me about them later. All right, so I think that we've covered all of our content. It was pretty simple best practices. But I think they're really, really valuable. And if you have to take them to heart, then you're really going to get the best value out of the data fabric. So we have a couple other sessions we recommend you go see if you want to learn more about migrating from an old CDT data store approach over to synced records. There's a session later today. There's also a session, I touched on Process HQ a few times during this session, so if you want to know more about that, there's another session later today. And then if you really want to see some of the best applications that have been built on Appian, a lot of them using synced records, you should go and see how our engineering team runs Appian on Appian. Some of the best apps I've ever seen have been built on it. But they've been building them over the last 20 years, so they're pretty amazing. So now I'll open it up to Q&A if you guys have any questions. Is there like a microphone? Cool.
Hello. So as you mentioned, a lot of the security roles are usually embedded in like applications or at that level, and they're user-based often.
Mm-hmm.
When you're coming into this sphere, are you able to inherit that in some way, even if you're not replacing something, but it's going to be interacting with the data fabric?
So when you're creating a new record, how do we usually handle those user-based
Correct.
security roles?
Correct.
So, I mean, it becomes, usually I'll go with that conversation to ask them, like, where are they maintaining their groups? Are they maintaining their groups in Appian? Do they want to maintain their groups outside of Appian? It becomes a conversation about, like, oh, do you have Azure AD groups that you want to sync into Appian? And those people start inheriting a lot of the security. So that's commonly the conversation you'll end up having, but yeah. So we would recommend doing sort of like a sync of those groups across where the source of truth is, and then and keep that in Appian, yeah.
I have a very fundamental question.
Okay.
Excuse me if I don't make any sense. I'm new to Appian. So you say don't collect data, and then you say sync all data. So how is it different?
I hope no one would call me on this. So there's a fine line between collecting and connecting. And there are circumstances where to use the sync, you essentially are collecting that data, right? And the example I used earlier with that process back sync, I mean, essentially you are collecting that data. Appian makes it very easy to collect that data and very easy to write that data back to the source systems. But in essence, you, in that circumstance, are collecting the data. when you're using more of a web service-backed approach, if you're happy with the daily sync, that you're not really collecting the data in that you're storing a cache of it temporarily, but you're not asking that other system to do anything for you. They don't need to send you anything. It's all sort of set up through the Appian, web service-backed approach. But yes, there is very small difference between collecting, connecting. The big difference is that Appian connects to a bunch of different types of sources. You can use this JDBC connection to connect to various different databases. You can use your web service-backed approach. You can use a process-backed approach. So yeah, I mean, I understand that it's a very slight difference, but where I think we differentiate is what we're using that data for. Most of the data lake and warehouses applications are not concerned about treating your data in a way that you can use it for both transactional processing and for analytics purposes, and that's the big differentiator. So the way we're collecting the data, we're keeping it in a format that you can then take action against it, and hopefully it's pretty real time. But yeah, in scenarios where it doesn't fit exactly what we need to sync it up where it is, we do need to sort of temporarily collect it. Yeah.
Thank you. And I hear that I'm not directly working on it. I'm in the backend data team, and my team says that there's a limit on the cache. So if not all data could be synced there, if it is beyond that, I think 4 million records, right?
Yeah. So there is a link on the number of rows that has been going up consistently for the last few years. I know the engineering team is still focused on increasing that limit. But yeah, it's 4 million rows right now. That doesn't mean you can't access more than 4 million rows from Appian. It does mean you can't access 4 million rows through the data sync features, right? So there is a feature in Appian that was released, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 versions ago, that will allow you to say, I want to keep the last X number of rows, the last 4 million rows, whatever the current limit is, based on this timestamp. So that lets you, keep a portion of the data. Your application is going to remain functional, even if you go over that limit. It's just going to keep the last X amount. And as I said earlier, I still recommend going with that approach, especially for list views. I mean, how often are you going to be going through more than 4 million rows in a grid? You shouldn't be spending your time doing that. But you can then have maybe a different view that's doing the entire 10 million or 20 million rows of data. Yeah.
Understood.
But that's increasing. I know they're still focused on that. So
I can understand. It's this is more for operational data, so you don't really need the whole warehouse here.
Yeah.
Warehouse is for analytics purposes. Yeah. That makes sense. And yeah, there is a feature to set last 4 million records or something like that, right? Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. Question over there?
Hi. So let's say you're syncing directly into a database. What does the latency look like? If I make a change in Appian, how quickly does that get synced?
So if you're changing in an Appian, it's immediate, right? I mean, maybe not half a second or something like that, but whatever the right time is, because the way that it actually is working is it's sort of writing to the cache and writing to the database at the same time. So it's not writing to the database and then refreshing a cache or anything like that. If you were to write to that, so say you didn't own that database and you're writing to that database from a different system, that's a different scenario, right? In that circumstance, it would be whenever you're having to sync that data. I mean, there's a couple options on how you can do it. I mentioned you can set up a webhook to essentially be alerted that a data element has changed. You can have a daily sync. If it's something like what they needed was every 4 hours, you can just trigger a sync every 4 hours, like a full sync if you wanted to do that.
What are the limitations on how often you could trigger?
I mean, there's no technical limitation on how often you could do it. There's operational limitation. You probably don't want to do it more than every 15 minutes or something like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, so I guess I'm kind of more of a old school Appian developer.
Yeah.
I know how to do the CTs very well. I'm still learning the synced record stuff. And so my question is kind of, as for my project specifically, we have very complex security that we have to hold in the database because there's all these different locations, roles,
right?
Whatever. So I guess my question is, I've always used traditional record security.
Yep.
Is there a benefit or a major difference between saying for those database security roles to use row level security?
So historically, I guess if you're doing it through an old CDT, you're still using records, but you're just using non-synced records.
Yes, sir.
So you're setting up a user filter and putting in your query
Yes.
rules in there. Yeah. I mean, functionally, it's not that different. The end result. The advantage you get with the low code row level security is it gives you the ability to start utilizing groups and users a lot more efficiently than the old approach. So, for example, if you had a really common use case would be I've got a support case and I've got a list of watchers, and I want the watchers to see the support case, right? Historically, that would be kind of difficult to do if your watcher group included like a list of users that might have been in a different table, but also a group, right? Maybe you stored the group ID in your table and you wanted anybody in this group ID, but also this list of users, right? It would be pretty difficult because there's no way to figure out what groups I'm in at runtime efficiently in the old approach. Whereas in the new approach, it would be trivial. You could say the row level security rules would be in this group, and you would be able to choose a field of group type, or in this relationship as one of the users in this relationship. So it'd be trivial to set up. So I'd say the biggest performance advantages come from using the row level security with users and groups. But functionally, you usually accomplish the same thing. But yeah, in those circumstances, it can be slower. There's a question here. Yeah, you could just yell it, yeah.
So I understand that typically you don't need access to more than 4 million records on a transaction basis. But what's the best practice for simple searches? If you want to search for, out of 10 million or 20 million records, I think those are pretty typical, right?
Really large data sets doing searches.
I want to search,
That's a difficult problem to solve in Appian. I mean, there's no reason that with Data Fabric, you can't do more than 4 million. So I'll put that out there first. So if you're going to do it with the old the CDT and data store approach, you can do those searches against your record type. You just need to make sure that the interface that you're building your grid off of, right? Usually when you're not dealing with synced records, your interface is built off of view, right? That's often the case because you've got related data that's in your grid, maybe a status or something like that that's sitting in another table. You might even be relating down to one-to-many relationships. So you need to make sure that when you're doing searches in a grid that's based on a view over a lot of records, and it's what I talked about before, you have to optimize those views for the queries that people are making. Because when you do a search in Appian, it's going to be doing a search where that data, are we all done? Okay. I can talk to you right after this.
Yep.